Hi everybody. Please be sure to subscribe to this channel and like the video. So I'm back. I decided to take a look at the Netflix miniseries called African Queens Njinga. Episode 1, The Death of a King. And I'm somebody who knows about Nzinga, and in the actual documentary they pronounce it Njinga, and it shows up in several different sources, two ways: Nzinga or Njinga, and that's what happens when you end up getting colonized by a European country who pronounces things differently. But whatever. Nevertheless, I decided to take a look at it, and for those of you who watch my channel know I'm a history teacher, and sometimes I hate watch things. So I wanted to find out at least what people are looking at, and just in case my students come to me with information about this, seeing that I teach world history up until this point. Because I can see them watching this and thinking they know. So anyway, the documentary, or it's a dramatized documentary, should I say. So people are like acting out, and then you have like scholars or professors coming in and giving their commentary. So it starts in Ndongo, 1617. Ndongo is the former name of what we now know as Angola, at the southwest tip, the southwest corner of Africa, in 1617. All right, so about 2 years before Africans are brought in significant numbers to what we now know as the United States. So they talk about Nzinga, which is pronounced Njinga. I'll just go with Njinga because somebody's gonna get in the comments and be like, "Well, that's not the way they said it." She was born at a time where her father was king, but he was already struggling with the conflict with the Portuguese, as they have found their way down Africa's coast and are looking to colonize and enslave. Okay, now one of the things people have to remember, and I'm sure people are like, "Well, why Ndongo/Angola?" Because it's more southern than, say, Nigeria or Ghana. Um, so you need to be sure to note that Angola is a much easier place to get African people, and transport them more quickly and more cheaply to the largest colony that Brazil creates. I mean, the Portuguese create, which is known as Brazil. That's why when you go to Brazil, people speak Portuguese. That's why, because it's colonized by them. And the fact that they're still speaking Portuguese in Brazil and Angola lets you know how deep European colonization runs. The minute your language is no longer your significant language and main language, that tells you who's in control still. Facts. All right. So the thing was, in colonizing South America, they want to find cheap, quick, efficient ways to get Africans there. And Angola is a space to do that. Okay. So just keep that in mind. So then they have some black female professor from the University of Chicago that is talking about how the Portuguese had already been in Ndongo for about 50 years, which is true. And she says their mission, all right, has already was twofold. This is what she says: one, to Christianize them, and two, to expand their territory in Africa. Ma'am, I see why a large, white, reputable university like University of Chicago would hire such a black person or person of color. All right, Christianity was always used as a cloak, an unknowing cloak. It wasn't like, oh, an innocent way people thought they were using their religion. Okay? A cloak to expand and colonize and carry out heinous crimes against humanity, like those carry out against Africans who become enslaved in the Americas. Okay? So be sure, in case you think I'm making this up, to see Ibram Kendi's seminal text, Stand from the Beginning. Not to mention, if you want to go straight to the root, the Portuguese primary source is written by a man named Zarara, Conquest of Discovery. You can read translated versions to this day, and you have more access. You can with a click. All right. Anyway, so Ndongo is under pressure to protect his country from the Portuguese, and that is the King of Ndongo is under pressure to protect his country from the Portuguese. Right? They've already found their way into Angola, further inland at this point. So he is training Njinga to fight and protect the country against his own soldiers, just in preparation. So he has his best and most skilled people, female soldiers who he has his daughter fighting against to learn the techniques of military conquest. And that's important because we have these ideas about African military, and they must have been weak in comparison to Europeans. What gave Europeans power were guns, okay? And gunpowder that came from China that was developed in the Middle East with the gunpowder empires across the Mughals, across the Safavids, across the Ottomans. And they really develop quickly and perfect, in many ways, the use of guns. And that's why they're able to conquer, not because militarily they were just so smart. I mean, we could talk about the Zulu people as well, like their level of preparation, but there are some things that they were not prepared for scientifically. And the way in which these kind of things are brought across the world, everybody doesn't get access to them. Anyway, so they go on. As a princess, she has female attendants in Njinga, some of whom have military training and a military presence. So, nevertheless, they point out that it was still unusual at this time for women to be in the military, which is why I think this story is so striking. And if we're being honest, even today, it's unusual. Just because people can doesn't mean they do or are able to. I mean, just within the United States, just because you have access to that doesn't mean that that's common. So it's a dramatized version, like I said, of these historical events, but it makes it a bit more accessible, I think, to people who don't normally engage or like to read history. And I stand by the fact that a lot of people don't like history because they don't see themselves in it, particularly people of color. Anyway, but it makes it a bit more accessible, people who aren't even used to this time period. So it also helps contextualize Ndongo. And once again, that's what we now know today as Angola. The kingdom capital is a place called Cabasa, and it is further inside the country, which also causes the Portuguese to have to work harder to get inland. So even though they're already stealing Africans off the coast to Angola, once again, because they've done a cost benefit analysis with human lives, okay, the cry for Black Lives Matter goes back centuries, okay? They've already done a cost benefit analysis and say this is a cheaper use, right? And they need to get inland to get to the kingdom because that is where the root of the power is that they need to pull out. All right. So Finji is Njinga's sister, who is also highlighted briefly in the first episode. She's the youngest of the king's three daughters. They demonstrate how she was not as astute, it appeared, in military ventures as her sister. She seemed much more distracted by men or crushes, which would have been normal for her age, but the time was really ripe with military conquest when Njinga needed her family to be more focused. So she also has a brother in Bunduni. Her brother is awfully ambitious, and there is some familial rivalry, okay, which goes left. I know the historical stories, but I'm not going to ruin it. So they do talk about in the documentary, this dramatized documentary, about how there is difficulty fighting the Portuguese, especially as parts of the Ndongo kingdom, are fairly strong, but there is in any country, nobles who want to conquer the king and claim territory. And the Portuguese come in and help exploit that desire to conquer the Ndongo kingdom and supply them with weapons that they can use, because what they are essentially doing is trying to divide and conquer, right? And so they give them guns like weapons, and this is just what I know historically. They didn't really show this yet. Things they didn't have before. Now, the brothers in Njinga's family have tension and battle about whether the king should fight in a new battle against the rebellious part of Ndongo. Like I just told you, the nobles who want to conquer. Well, it's kind of this rogue group of warriors, but nevertheless, people who know how to like rule. So, because one brother feels as if the king should remind the people who he is and what he stands for, because at the time, people know of their king, but they haven't necessarily seen him. I mean, this is a big country. And that leaves room for others to come in and degrade and belittle and gain support for their rebellion against the king. And then, however, one brother feels like the king doesn't have to remind anybody why he's king. And I think that's okay in theory and before the digital age. But as I watched, I was like, you might want to take a visit up there, bruh. But that's just me and Njinga. But anyway, so even as they prepare for war, Njinga is still, keep in mind that she's the mother of an infant boy, her first child. And they talk about the social dynamics, how Njinga was a part of the culture where female royalty could have male concubines after a husband. So she had her babes, okay? And that's equality for your ass. All right. But one of her concubines is the father of her royal child. And that's actually why there's so much tension between the brothers of the king and Jinga's brothers, because they don't have the same mother, but they still belong to the father, which makes them royalty. All right. And the idea of the wife versus the concubine's child. I'm telling you, history can get good if you pay attention. All right. So they show how Njinga counsels her father about not going to battle to prove a point as he's older and it's just too dangerous. She suggests he focuses on finding ways to unite the people against the Portuguese. Okay. Her father is killed on his way to battle by one of his royal attendants. And it wasn't even in battle, it was on the way to battle. And the historian says that it was likely that they separated him in terms of mapping out the struggle, claiming to protect him, to isolate him and to kill him. And you can't trust anybody. And at this time, this becomes especially hurtful because the royal family is family, right? The attendants don't have the same claim to the royal name, which makes them kind of whatever to it, right? Because it's not theirs to protect. So without the father, there is a question about who will lead. So the brother starts ridding the kingdom of possible heirs. Sounds very biblical too. Because there are children by concubines and not the wedded mother, he feels entitled to the kingdom. He starts knocking off people. He kills his brother. He also kills Njinga's infant son, whom he sees as a threat to his power. As an infant. King Herod tried the same thing in the Bible. Not good. The pharaohs tried the same thing in the Bible. It always comes at a price. All right. So they show how the Portuguese are finding and studying how to infiltrate the kingdom. Like I said, and not to mention the scramble for Africa later. Africa is rich in natural resources. Okay? Don't get me started on that. How everybody's cell phone across the world wouldn't work without coltan. Okay? Which is in the Congo, a natural mineral. And then people in the Congo don't even have access to that technology. But we live in a post-colonial society. Miss me with the bullshit. So anyway, they enlist the help of fierce warriors. And these fierce warriors are known as Mbagala. And they're kind of a rogue group, and they're looking to advance in society, like to take over. And they align with the Portuguese because of what they have to offer them. Like I said, advanced weapons. The Portuguese use the expertise of these people in knowing the land, knowing the geography, having an axe to grind against the king, or the royal family at this point, to help further their conquest. Now, the part that threw me was when they added that anachronism of reggae music when they showed these so-called Mbagala people. Okay. Jada, I already have an issue with you. But reggae music was not created by then. Reggae music is a creation out of Jamaica that comes after the conquest of black people enslaved in another part of the world that they never existed prior to slavery. But I guess this was y'all's way of indicating they were different and rebellious, and I find that a little problematic. But that's just me. Okay, now what's also important, because this is something I find with students who always ask this, even despite their participation sometimes in these larger white structures of power. Everybody always asks, well, how come they didn't side with each other to get the Portuguese out? They don't automatically identify with each other. Africans are an invention of the European lingo and the way in which they have grouped and seen people. So much like the indigenous peoples to the Americas, they have their own cultures, societies, governments amongst their different groups. So they don't automatically identify with each other simply because they live in the same country. And they can't always understand what is bound to happen in the Americas. Their concept of slavery is having prisoners of war who will work for about 7 years and then will be released. But they work at the behest of another kingdom despite their culture. So they don't automatically see it that way. And so that also has to be understood with this idea of selling Africans to white people, Africans selling Africans. Like, cut the bullshit. Like, yeah, there is a lot of that. Don't get me wrong. But I'm also saying to contextualize it properly means to understand that these just become prisoners of war in their mind. Chattel slavery, the first time that exists is in the Americas by the Europeans. And this is the idea of owning human persons as property. In law, in deed, like you have, like you to prove you own a house, and policy. That had never existed across the world. So the concept of slavery, like having control over somebody versus being someone's property, is brand new at this point in history. All right. So anyway, Njinga continues to give counsel to her brother, despite the fact that he murdered her son. That had to be painful. So Njinga decided to go and face the Mbegala soldiers to convince them to be on the side of the royalty and not the Portuguese, even though her brother forbade it. And she felt like he was making a poor decision by not going to fight them or to get their support, because the Portuguese are penetrating the kingdom. And the Mbegala are rogue, violent warriors, and they want control. And she's like, we have to offer them something because they might be our only hope. And they can also be what sends us into complete obscurity, like by obliterating them. So the first episode ends with the Mbegala soldiers pinning her down in Njinga after not listening to her brother and going. And she says she wants to support the royalty. She wants them to support the royalty. And the Mbegala are like, and he pins her down, and she has a knife to him, basically after he thinks he's conquered her. And she says, are you ready to talk now? So that's how the episode ends. I'll catch up with it. But for those of you who are interested, take a look. Tell me what you think. Put it in the comments. And I'll talk to y'all soon. Bye.